Heather McLeod, she's going to talk about the price of success. And I hate it when somebody says the price instead of the rewards of success. So let's find out a bit more. But she's going to talk about the slower and more costly trajectories at the end of life. And before I ask Heather to sort of start, I'm just going to describe who had the reason. I'm sure I'm not going to do justice here. But Professor Heather McLeod has worked on healthcare financing, health policy and social security policy from an academic base for more than 20 years. In South Africa, she consulted to the National Treasury and the Department of Health and served on several statutory bodies, including the regulator and financial services and the regulator of private health insurance. She's lived in New Zealand since 2010, worked for the Ministry of Health and Palliative Care Council from 2012 to 2015, consulted in the Ministry of Health to health funders and NGOs and on end of life and palliative care, which is something she's going to talk about now. And she has sort of visiting appointments in Cape Town, University of Stellenbosch, and the University of Auckland. Heather, welcome. Please take the floor. Thank you.
Hitesh, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. Just really sad not to be in Singapore, one of my favorite cities in the world, but at least we could do this virtually. I'm going to be talking from about a study that was done here locally, but it does have global implications. And we'll start by looking at births and deaths in New Zealand. New Zealand has about 5 million people, so it's just a little bit smaller than Singapore. This is data going back to 1875, and the dark blue line is deaths, the light blue line is births. This peak in deaths is the 1918 flu epidemic, by the way. This one here is the Second World War. But aside from those two events, deaths have really emerged quite steadily over the years, and they're currently at the level of about 30,000 deaths a year. If you look at births, births reached 30,000 a year round about 1912 or so. They were at that level through to the Second World War, and then there was a rapid increase. So from about 30,000 a year to 60,000 a year, and they've stayed at the 60,000 a year level ever since. That's important. I mean, deaths at the moment are about half of births in the country, but the dotted lines show you what projections are like through to 2043, so that's 22 years away. And gradually deaths will catch up. I mean, we often talk here, entrances to the world, exits from the world. And so we're going to have to catch up to that 60,000 level a year fairly rapidly. So that's part of the issue. And I'm coming at this study from the view of what Treasury would think about what this is going to mean for taxes, what it's going to mean for expenditure. One of the things that our national demographers tell us is that not only will there be many more deaths, what I'm comparing here is deaths in 2021 in the dark blue, 2043 in the pale blue. Not only will there be a huge increase in the number of deaths, but very importantly, there's an increase in the age of dying. And it's really important. In a few slides' time, we'll be talking about cancer. And these are the cancer years, kind of here in the late adult years. We're expecting a decline in deaths in those years, but a massive increase, more than doubling in the sort of 85 to 89, even more than a doubling in the to 94, and more so even in 95 plus. We're actually doing a lot of our work these days, taking age bands all the way through to 100 plus. And I suspect in a few years' time, we'll want to add another 5 years to that as well. So from a planning perspective around delivering palliative care for the country, this is a hugely important issue. One of the other things that was really important, and Francois talked about this earlier, this question about the compression of morbidity. You know, epidemiologists argued for years over whether we would live longer in good health or bad health, or what would happen. This was a really interesting study done by an epidemiologist who, in fact, also worked for IHME in Seattle for 2 years. And he did this study and found quite conclusively that what was happening was that we were living so much longer, that we were also living, so that we were living longer in good health, but we were also living longer in poor health. And that is a fairly scary thing from a Treasury perspective, to look at the consequences of it. So, for example, a female New Zealander at age 65 years of age can expect to live another 10.6 years independently on average, about half of her remaining life. And then another 10.7 years with functional limitations, of which she will need daily assistance for nearly 5 years at the end of life. Men tend to die rather quicker. They need daily assistance for 3 years at the end of life. But this is a huge extra issue to try to deal with. The other piece of information that was behind this study was a really interesting paper. It comes from some work by Lynn and Adamson in the US, Rand Health, around about 2003. And they talked about different trajectories at the end of life. Here's the cancer trajectory, and this is the one that hospices and palliative care know well. So people are functioning reasonably well for quite a long period of time, and then there's a fairly predictable and rapid decline before death. The second group that they talked about were what they call failures. And so people are in and out of hospital, like one these exacerbations. They seem to recover, but if you look back in time, you realize that they didn't recover quite to the functioning level of before. And sometimes death happens very unexpectedly in those groups, because it's during one of these exacerbations that death suddenly happens. The final group that they looked at was frailty and dementia, or as they called it, prolonged dwindling. You could actually, as actuaries, we would add another group at least, which would be accidents, and with the typical sort of accident hump in the early years. But the interesting thing was that Palliative Care Australia, back in 2010, suggested that this cancer trajectory probably peaked around age 65, the heart and lung failures at 75, and the frailty and dementias in those who lived past 85. So if you think back to what we're expecting with this aging of deaths, this was another piece to that particular puzzle. So what we undertook for the Ministry of Health was this trajectories study. It's all deaths in the country that occurred during a calendar year, 2015. And then it's really one of those big linked data exercises. We linked the healthcare utilization for every death in the country back 10 years for most services. Some things are longer. We have 25 years for the cancer registry and for hospital admissions. And then Interi, which is a form of assessment that is done around the country these days. It's also an international form of assessment. Interi is much shorter. It was only 3 years of data. The original study question was to find out who was not reached by specialist palliative care. And by that we mean hospices and hospitals. We were also interested in how many people were actually in aged residential care. But it turned out that there were, by having this huge, big linked data set, we were able to do a number of other things as well. And so I'm going to share with you a few elements, sometimes just one or two slides from each of the parts of the study, but there were several other parts to the study later on, including health system costing, which I will show you. I'm not going to go through the detail of all the sets of data that we linked, other than to say we have mortality and cancer, then pretty much the entire history of people in the public sector. But what was interesting is that we were able to link and include 4 sets that had never been linked before. The aged residential care, which is care for the elderly, these inter-RI assessments, which are very detailed information about people's functioning and frailty, and then a history of hospice care and hospice inpatient units. I worked extensively for hospices over the years, and so had access to that data as well. We also did some work on hospital palliative care. So to give you a sense of it, and one of the most important things in any of this work is that it's always the material by age bands is hugely informative. So you'll see a number of graphs here today that run from under 1 through to 100 plus. The totals will be on the right. Also on the graph will be a black line, and that black line is the actual numbers of deaths in each age band. So, you know, already our deaths are quite late in life. They're very few at younger ages, but it does give you a bit of a sense. And this is, of course, what's going to double and move to the right. So let's start with something that turns out to be relatively, you would think is rather simple, but no one had looked at it before. How many people were ever in the cancer registry, and what did they die of? And the shape is really interesting, and you're going to see this shape throughout the slides this afternoon. I come from Africa, as several of the other people have done today, Ian, Francois, and this to me looks like a hippo. You've got this head, you've got a body above a waterline, and these hippo shapes come up again and again in the data. So what's interesting is that cancer does peak around 55 to 65. So the dark blue is people who are in the cancer registry. So they've had a cancer diagnosed, and they die of cancer. And look how it declines with age. The interesting thing, and that we hadn't been aware of before, was what I call a kind of cloak on the back of the hippo, and that's this pale blue. So these are people who are in the cancer registry, but die of something else. And that's a really interesting group because they end up being typically fairly frail. And so they're dying of other causes, not of the cancer. A good example, of course, would be men with prostate cancer who die with cancer as opposed to dying of cancer. Another really surprising result when we first saw it was who was using aged residential care, because the proportion of people in the population as a whole is quite small. But when we look at it in terms of the proportion of people dying, we get this incredibly strong picture by age. And so by the time you're getting to kind of 90, nearly 3/4 of people use aged residential care in New Zealand. It goes up to 82% and then nearly 90% by the 100 plus mark. And so it was a real surprise to find that across all deaths, all ages, all causes, 44% of people spent some time in aged residential care before they died. We had no idea that that was the case. The third really interesting finding that I want to share with you is dementia. Dementia is really badly or poorly represented in cause of death data. And that's typically because the person dies of pneumonia, or they die after a fall, or they might have ischemic heart disease or something like that. But we need to actually look behind that at the underlying issues that they had at the time. And so part of the study was particularly interesting because we pulled out all of those who died with dementia. So the dark blue here are the people who died of dementia on the death certificate. But if you add to it this paler group, those are the people who died with dementia. And we got that from all of the other information about their hospitalizations, the drugs, and these inter-RI assessments. And so this was also a surprise, was just how many people in total. 27% of all deaths in the country in 2015 were people who died with dementia, way bigger than we had thought. So out of that, we worked to create some trajectory groups, and we ended up with 5 groups that we used. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it's there for you if you want to read it. The most important thing is that these groups are allocated sequentially. A lot of work is done where cancer is pulled out first because it's easy. But we wanted to start with what we thought might be the longest and slowest trajectories, and that is dementia. And so we started with dementia, then the cancers, then a group that we call chronic disease, but in fact, a better definition might be frail elderly. Then there's a group that's got a dreadful title, and I wished I hadn't used it at the time, but it's related to some earlier work that we'd done, which was called the need for palliative care. And so this references those definitions of who might need palliative care. And then as actuaries, you'd be familiar with the last group, the sudden deaths. And they happen too quickly, they're accidents, self-harm, and a little bit of violence. Those are the ones that are too rapid to need palliative care. So these are the 5 groups by age. And I said to you, you'd be seeing more hippo shapes. The cancer group is the red one here, and that has a hippo shape. On the back of the hippo are the people who are the frail elderly. So it includes those that were in that cloak on the back of the hippo, but it also includes other people who were frail enough to be admitted to aged residential care or frail enough to have care being delivered at home. The dementia group we've talked about, that's here in purple. You'd be familiar with what accident humps look like. So that's the pale color here. And then that leaves us this pale blue color, which is a really strange group, which has a lot of deaths under age 1 from congenital conditions or from perinatal conditions. Then you've got some of the heart disease is here in the middle, but it actually tails off quite substantially later. And so the most important thing as we start looking at these older ages is it's not cancer that people are dying of, but they're dying with frailty and dementia and virtually nothing else. And so if deaths are going to be at older ages, then the chances are we're going to be seeing more of the dark blue and the purple. When we looked at it in 2015 at the number of deaths in each of these groups, it was a huge surprise to the ministry to find that actually there were more deaths in the dementia group than they were in the cancer group. And that really radically changed the way in which time and attention was allocated to dementia and some of the consequences of dementia. So chronic disease groups, a little bit smaller than the other 2. The young chronics, if you like, and the congenital conditions, smaller than that, and then a small group of sudden deaths. So you'll see those 5 groups being used a lot. We've done projections of this through to 2043 with our national demographers, and the deaths from cancer, yes, are expected to go up, that's this line, but the deaths from the chronic disease or in the chronic disease group and the dementia group go up even more strongly. In fact, the dementia group pretty much doubles over this time horizon of the next 22 years. So let's take a look at a few things. You'll also see a number of graphs that look like this, where we've got the 5 groups along the bottom and the total on the right. So dementia, cancer, chronic disease are the 3 that we are most interested in today. This is how many people used aged residential care at the end of life. And 85% of the dementia group utilized aged residential care. What was a surprise was to find that nearly, 27% of the cancer group also did, and about half of those in the chronic disease group. We could look then at any one of the services that I talked about as having in the data. One of the more interesting things was that although the hospitals had a sense that they were getting a lot of elderly patients transferred from aged residential care, we discovered that the dementia group, 30% of them had absolutely no contact with a hospital or an emergency department in the last year of life. And that was a real surprise too in this work. The people who utilize those 2 services most are in fact in the cancer group. And we also did a lot of work looking at frequency and the intensity, some people with multiple admissions. So on the main question, on this need for palliative care, what do we know about that? Well, when we look at who is using hospice services, we have another one of those hippos. Not surprising, because hospices originally were formed to deal with cancer, although they try to expand their services well beyond that. But cancer is still a major part of what they do. And so their involvement with people is mostly here in these kind of 45 to 75 year age band, but not as you get older. And we'd known this for a few years. So this was a confirmation of what we knew. In New Zealand, around 31% of all people who die have support from hospice in doing so. That's across all causes of death as well. If we look at it by cause of death, of course, the sudden deaths are unlikely to survive for hospice care. There is the occasional one actually that does. But the cancer group, 78% of them are seen by hospice, but only 14% of the dementia group and about 17% of the chronic disease group. And so it was really important for planning for palliative care here to begin to think who was actually seeing these patients. If we superimpose what I showed a few slides ago on aged residential care, and then also superimpose this need for palliative care work that we did earlier, you get this picture. So the green here is now aged residential care. The dark red color is hospice only, and the hashed color is hospice and aged residential care. So you have got some people using both. But as we said, cancer has predominantly hospice, dementia has predominantly aged residential care, providing their end-of-life care. And this was really important because from a contracting perspective, aged residential care had never been told that they had to do palliative care. So this really changed the whole dynamic around how it was perceived within aged residential care, enabled them to go back and negotiate for some funding to try to get more funding for this work at the end of life. And it really just changed the way people viewed aged residential care completely. Very useful parts of the study. This is probably the most important slide from that perspective. If you look at it by age, here's the red hippo of hospice. Here's the people who use hospice and aged residential care in the hashed color. The green is aged residential care only. And then from a planning perspective, what's really important to us is this cream group. The white group fall outside of the expected need for palliative care. It's about 10% of deaths in total. But we're really interested in this 26%, the cream group, who are not getting support from hospice, not getting support from aged residential care, and therefore must be getting support, we hope, from general practitioners or from district nursing. But we actually don't know. It's one area where our data is fairly blind. So a lot of work has now gone on in actually trying to work with those parties to try to see and to try to give them more support for them to provide palliative care to people who need it. Let me share with you quickly a few other things that were in this study. Place of care was part of a really interesting part of it. If you can imagine, we've got all of the history of what happened to these 31,000 people, and we have it on a daily basis. So we can look at it over the last 3 years of life, the last year of life, the transitions that they make, and it turned out to be fascinating. It's one of those times where instead of amalgamating the data in months or weeks or something like that, we started out simply by graphing it on a daily basis. And the pictures were remarkably smooth. So this is the chronic disease group. Over the last 3 years of life, death is here on the right-hand side. The color scheme is what I've been using up till now. So hospital is dark blue. The green is aged residential care. Red is hospice inpatient. And gold is hospice care at home. Cream is home with hopefully some other support. So the chronic disease group, right 3 years prior to death, some of them are already in aged residential care. They're becoming frail. And then look at the huge increase in utilization of public hospital and aged residential care. Not a lot of hospice involvement. Contrast that with what's happening with cancer. And you can see how many of the cancer group were seen by hospice, both inpatient unit right at the end, but also hospice at home. And so very few not being seen at all in any of the settings. Dementia, around 30% or so are in either hospital or aged residential care already, 3 years prior to death. By the time death occurs, almost all of them are in those settings. It's very unusual for anyone to be at home. So if we looked at the 5 different groups and just looked at the last year of life, you have these very different utilizations of services. What is also interesting is just how many people need a bed at the end of life. It was one of those myths. Palliative care was telling itself that they were providing care at home. But when you look at it, they were for a period, but right at the end, it was very rare for somebody to actually remain at home. It's really only in this cancer group that that could happen. And even a large proportion of those end up in a bed somewhere else. So this idea of needing a bed somewhere also leads to another way of thinking about how do we look at the funding across public hospitals, hospices, aged residential care, and how do we equalize it so that people are being treated fairly across those different ones. Briefly, there are very different funding models in those different areas. And the UK did a lot of work trying to bring these together a few years ago. We were also interested in trying to make it a lot fairer. We're able to use things like that to do projections, and this is usually a huge shock to people who are planning care. This looks at projections for 2021 and 2043 on the right, and this is the difference, for example, in the dementia group. There is no way that we are going to be building that many more aged residential care facilities or beds. And so there's a massive challenge coming in palliative care and end-of-life care in how is it even remotely feasible to keep people at home? And the answer is it's not easy to. It's just so hard on families. So that the idea that somehow you can keep them out of hospital or aged care is probably not true. And that's going to put huge pressure on the system. One of the rather fun things working with big data and with a colleague of mine, whom I'll tell you about in a moment, is we chose to animate the transition. So you can imagine we've got a data set with where people were every day in the last year of life. But that also means we know what transitions they made, for example, from hospital to aged care or from aged care back to hospital. And so for each of these are the four main groups, we can look at places that they moved to. I'm not going to show you the animation here, but the numbers are big. And this is on the day of death, for example, where 118 people moved from aged care to hospital. 78 had moved from hospital to aged care. The numbers are really large. You're welcome to use this folder and have a look at them and download some of the transitions and play them through. When we've played them to planners, they've been absolutely riveted. I can remember in one meeting having to play it through 3 times because the doctors couldn't believe how much people were moving around at the end of life. It's also been incredibly useful to use it to discuss with emergency transport groups, ambulance groups, and that has changed how the ambulances interact with people who are receiving palliative care. It's meant some data has been joined up. People no longer get transferred automatically. So it's really improving care for everybody. And it's also helped to set some targets to reduce transitions even further. Transitions are not good for people and they're not good for families. The final thing I want to share with you is just a brief introduction to the work on health system costing at the end of life. And I guess as actuaries, you'd probably be particularly interested in this. So again, if we start out by age, we know cost for the under ones is really high. It's high for the 1 to 4 group. The major part of the cost is hospitalization. As you get older in life, so this green wedge of aged residential care comes in. Hospice is just this tiny red bit. But interestingly, hospital costs decline quite sharply later in life. And you got a hint of that with those people with dementia not actually utilizing hospital at all. So some of the things that people say about aging populations and what it will do is really not borne out. It's not about more cost for hospitals, it's more cost for frailty and helping people, the people with dementia actually is where this huge cost comes from. So this is really important information for Treasury and planning. And it's a bit of a shock actually for planners to realize that the aging population potentially has an increasing cost. So if we can look at it by those 5 trajectory groups, same color scheme. By the way, Singapore dollar is pretty close to a New Zealand dollar, so you can roughly use the same translation. In total, $45,000 per person per year in the last year of life. The sudden deaths are about $10,000. The young ones are about $25,000. Chronic disease, $44,000. Cancer is more expensive than the chronic disease, $47,000. But the really expensive one, $60,000, is the dementia group. That's the last year of life. The last 3 years of life, dementia, or in fact, chronic, let me go back one. Chronic disease was slightly lower than cancer on a 1-year basis. On a 3-year basis, it overtakes. Chronic disease becomes $87,000 for the last 3 years of life, but dementia, nearly $130,000. And so hugely sobering for the planners, for the Ministry of Health, for Treasury. Yeah, we can't afford it. We simply cannot. And we've known, broadly speaking, from less detailed work that we can't afford the healthcare of the aging population. Just how we're going to cope with fewer working age people and more people in these years, frankly, don't know. But it's a challenging problem, and one that actuaries hopefully are having some impact. Just a big shout out to my colleague June Atkinson at the University of Otago, who is a wonderful data wrangler and worked on this with me. And you're welcome to be in touch. There are some policy papers and some technical notes, and we'd be more than happy to share. And with that, let me hand back.
Oh, Heather, you can hear me clapping, but anyway, thank you. Fascinating. I went through it yesterday, and I mean, look, it's as you say, for planners going forward in population planning and some of the stuff here, probably really insightful. Yeah. So thank you. There's a couple of questions in here. Just going to start with. There's a biggie in terms of words, and this is trying to relate it to Singapore. So he's saying, do you think culture plays a part in the receptiveness towards palliative care? In Singapore, there's likely lower awareness of palliative care as compared to New Zealand, and Singaporeans may not be as receptive towards palliative care. It could be seen as giving up on medical treatment. So what do you think can be done to encourage palliative care, especially bulk of medical expenses towards the end of life?
That's an interesting question. You know, New Zealand is a very multicultural country. We've got something like 168 different cultures here. And a very large Asian group, including people obviously from Singapore. We see very high usage of palliative care here. So I think it's a question of how the hospices have an outreach. And I know hospices in New Zealand do have a relationship with hospices in Singapore. I think that as a family ever has experience of somebody dying in hospice and surrounded by the love, and we call it araha, it's a Maori word for love, but it's a bigger concept than that. But as they experience that and the support that the family gets, it tends to be word of mouth, I think. And so it becomes easier in the rest of the community. The other thing, of course, is that if you're an insurer and you're putting a benefit in there, it may be something where you can steer people in that direction. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's not easy to sort of answer in a quick couple of minutes a section, but thank you. The second one I have, what could be the reasons for a higher proportion of younger elderly using hospice services compared to the older elderly?
Oh, it's cancer. In those cancer years, that kind of middle of the hippo shape, that's the group utilizing hospice. And it's a really interesting question because in recent years, as more people go into aged residential care, we've already, you know, this study was done in 2015. Already by 2021, we've seen a dramatic shift in how many people are dying in aged residential care. And hospices are seeing fewer people than they used to. So their big challenge has always been, what is their role in an environment where deaths are at older ages? Cancer treatments are getting better. People are living longer. The question is, do they eventually die of cancer or do they die of something else? We think the evidence is showing us that mostly they die of something else. And just something I haven't put in today's presentation, but one of the developments of this work has been to look on a daily basis at how frailty develops towards the end of life. And there are just these incredibly strong patterns, as bowels stop working, as people stop being able to urinate, as they stop being able to eat, they're no longer communicating. Frailty is real. Frailty is, and that's, the price of success that I talked about. It's a bit of a shock, but that's pretty much what we're doing. And I would love to have been there in the room with Francois and with Howard to have a really robust discussion about this. But the more we delay death, this is what we're giving ourselves. And New Zealand is a very developed health system. It's maybe a little bit of a leading edge for what other countries with aging populations are going to see as well.
Yeah, look, thanks. Just a quick one. I'm not going to be able to get through all of them. If you get a chance later, maybe you can sort of get in and type some answers if we end up. But I'm going to ask you what I can, all right? So one of them from Xiaowen here is place of care at end of life is influenced by many factors. So what's available, what you or the family can afford. So what role do you see the private insurers playing in helping folks access the right place of care at the end of their life?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And I'm going to direct you to having a look at a company in South Africa called Percept, Shivani Ranshad. She's a health actuary. In fact, worked with her many times over the years. They've developed a company where they have a product where they steer people in the direction of hospice. They work with hospices. They've done some really interesting stuff with the reimbursement work. So yes, that's where that's a product sold into private insurance. Here in New Zealand, we don't have hospice care much at the end of life, largely because people are allowed to risk rate here. So they rate by age. And so there are very few people over the age of 65 actually still have private health insurance.
Mm-hmm. Scary, yeah. So it's unlike this sort of Singapore approach. These trajectories that you've got, this is from Ching Hock, are they predestined? Are there any intervention strategies which can reduce the reliance on aged residential care?
I wish there was a way out. I can remember sitting in a meeting once in the ministry where somebody said, well, let's prevent dementia. And I mean, it comes back to this, we keep on using terminology of preventing deaths. We don't. Mortality is 100%. We can only delay death. We can't prevent it. And so it's really interesting when you think about it from that perspective. People, the longer they live, it's actually harder and harder to leave your body. And that hard to leave your body is usually done through immense frailty. It's a massive philosophical issue, that one could unpack here. But we really are creating a problem in the developed world for what is going to happen at the end of life.
I'll have to introduce you to Aubrey de Grey, who might differ with you in terms of the end of life. Okay, let me just pick out a couple. So one of the ones says, how did the results of the New Zealand research influence the decisions of government insurers and the public in determining their palliative care options? I suppose you're still in the process, right?
Well, this work was effectively commissioned by the Ministry of Health. So the information was there for them to be able to have a look. There was a lot of work done on rethinking how to reimburse aged residential care. And they've been arguing for the inclusion of palliative care in their fee structure. Hospices have been using the work in order to try to argue for more support, because in fact hospices here are receive some government support, but mostly it's from donations and from the public. And so just evening up the playing field between those groups is an important discussion. Some of the best discussions with this happen when you can put everybody around a table: primary care, public hospitals, aged care, government funders, and then sit and talk, and hospices, and sit and talk through what is possible. And it's interesting how local solutions begin to develop and how groups begin to agree on cooperation and sharing and making sure that the journey is better for families and patients at the end of life.
I'll ask you one last one, and that's from Kawai. Is there any relationship between usage of palliative care and financial affluence of the patient's families?
No. We've done work by what we call our deprivation index. We've done, I think the issue is much more to do with what it is that you die of. You know, people will get a referral regardless. They're not having to pay anything in a public hospital. They're not paying for hospice care. Aged residential care is also heavily subsidized. So, you know, that isn't driving the choice here. It's much more a case of what the clinicians choose to do and where people are discharged from. So discharging from public hospital to where, you know, that's the more important one, actually.
Okay. Look, I really enjoyed this. I wish it a bit more time. Just for me, I really like the hippo, the analogy and the pictures there on the graphs. And I'll tell you why. I can say kia ora to you, and I can also say jambo to you. I can relate to both. So thank you very much, Heather.
Yeah,
really appreciate it. I think they'll do a poll now, and hopefully we can get you back maybe to answer some more questions at some time. Thank you.
But people are welcome to get in touch with me by email. Thank you.